The topic of today's panel is elections in the Middle East. For much of its history, elections obviously have meant very little in the region. Simply things done by dictators for the outside world to watch. Recently, we've had elections in 3 important countries of the region, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and finally in Turkey. Elections that have had sometimes surprising results with winners or leading figures that we didn't expect, but also with an enforcement of a status quo that we've seen in these countries before. Do elections matter in the Middle East? How should we understand these 3 elections? And how should Washington react to the results? That will be the topic of today's panel. We are fortunate to have with us here 3 distinguished scholars and experts on these respective countries. Hussein Abdel Hussein, the Washington bureau chief of the Kuwaiti newspaper Al-Rai. His beat includes Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and the U.S. foreign policy towards these countries. Hussein has worked as a visiting fellow with Chatham House in London. Dr. Aykan Erdemir, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He's a former member of the Turkish Parliament in 2011 to 2015. Dr. Erdemir is the editor of 7 books on Turkey, terrorism, and tolerance. Haneen Ghaddar, the inaugural Friedman Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute's Geduld, am I pronouncing it right? Geduld Program on Arab Politics, yes. Where she focuses on Shia politics throughout the Levant. Prior to that, she was the longtime managing editor of Lebanon's Now News magazine. As a matter of logistics, I will be asking the 3 panelists a set of questions to explore the various aspects of the topic, after which I will open the floor for questions by the audience. Please join me in welcoming these distinguished panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let me start with the procedural aspect of it. Usually when we talk on elections, the first question here in Washington is, were they free and fair? How free and fair were these elections? And does that matter in the first place?
Oh, okay. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's really my pleasure to be discussing this topic with you today. To answer your question very briefly, in Lebanon, because I'd be more comfortable talking about the elections in Lebanon, I've been following that up. The question is more complicated than that. The problem is there is some kind of democratic elections going on, but the problem was, there are 2 problems with it. It's not a dictatorship. People do go and vote. The problem is the electoral law was too complicated. The electoral law was not really a good law for the people to actually vote for their candidates. The alliances that gathered around this law through the elections did not make sense to the people, because there were enemies allying in certain areas, like Hariri and Michel Aoun, son-in-law, Gibran Bassil. People had to vote for lists, and a lot of these lists did not make sense for them. But also, people in Lebanon do not believe in this process anymore. Hezbollah has won long time ago, and they kind of established this victory, this elections, and people do not believe that democratic process is actually a means for change in Lebanon anymore, because we've been doing this for a long time. And March 14 in 2005, the pro-West, if you want, or anti-Hezbollah coalition won elections before. People voted for them, and they won the elections in 2005 and in 2009. And each time, their victory was hampered. They couldn't govern because Hezbollah used violence to make sure that no one else governs the country. So elections do not mean anything anymore for the people unless something bigger changes. So that's why I wouldn't say it was democratic because of this context, but technically it was.
In the Turkish case, I think what's interesting is the trajectory, because we're talking about a polity which, had elections as early as 1876 with the late Ottoman era, and had the first free and fair elections in 1946. an election which was lost by the ruling party, and the president, who happens to be a decorated field marshal, said, "My greatest victory in my career is the election I lost," which was true because it was the first time in 1950, with a free and fair election after the 46 elections, that there was a peaceful transfer of power. So that was Turkish politics coming to maturity. So what's striking about the 2018 elections is Turkey's backtracking, but radically. So it was not a fair election. One of the candidates, the pro-Kurdish candidate, Selahattin Demirtas, was running from prison. He had 10 minutes of airtime on public TV, and he couldn't even travel to the studio. He had to film it in the prison. How about fairness? Now, I argue it was semi-free. So not fair, but semi-free elections, in the sense that there was some ballot rigging, some stuffing, some intimidation, moving some of the Kurdish ballots to distant and dangerous terrain so that there's voter suppression. So all types of tricks were used. Overall, what's my estimate of fraud? Possibly at least a couple of percentage points, but mostly it's the unfairness part. That's where the elections are settled. Meaning, if you're the average Turkish voter, you do not have any access to quite a number of the opposition parties and leaders because you never see them on TV, including public and private. So there are tallies about how much airtime people get. So if you're President Erdogan, you get hours and days on time. If you're some of the opposition candidates, you get minutes or seconds in total, which means the elections are settled even before the voting starts. But if anything goes at the level of voting, there's always an opportunity to tweak it to make sure the vote that comes out of the ballot box is the one Erdogan likes.
Yeah, let me just start by saying this. In democracies, whether presidential, mostly the parliamentary system, people go to election whenever they disagree on things. So, say in Britain, some people want to leave the European Union, other people want to stay in the European Union, so they go to elections. The opposite happens in Lebanon, Iraq, and most Arab countries. If they disagree, they fight. They only go to elections after they have agreed. So the way election is being used, it's only being used to specify who gets what after everyone has agreed. So in case of Lebanon, the Prime Minister was forced out of the country for a few years. And he only came back after there was some sort of arrangement with Hezbollah. And after that, after everyone had settled, then they agreed on the electoral law. So surprises in these free and fair elections come within this system. So there's a system, and then within the system there are surprises. And the surprises are only, okay, well, the Aoun and the Christians got a couple more seats than the other guys who are the Sunnis or the Shia. The same thing happens in Iraq. So in terms of free and fair, you have to keep in mind that in Lebanon there are 4 or 5, there are sectarian leaders. I tend to call them oligarchs. They're the same leaders who've been there since the mid-1970s, and now they're passing on the leadership to their sons. So these people are still there, and they still have blocks. Now, whether their blocks is 15, 20, 25, that will be decided in election. But this guy will be there, and he'll be there for the election after this one. So we're only shifting within a known amount or a known timeline and a known space. And the same thing is happening in Iraq, except that in Iraq the situation is more fluid. The whole election process is still new, and the oligarchs are still emerging. So we have Sadr, we have the Kurds, they have their oligarchs from a long time ago. We have Maliki and Abadi, there's still new leaders who are emerging. So in this sense, it's been free and fair, but otherwise we still have the same system.
So that brings me to the question of choices. What is the actual choice that the voters had in this election? In Iraq, there's no escaping the sectarian nature of these divides. In Turkey, there's an entrenched Erdogan camp and an entrenched secular camp. And It's the same thing, nearly even the same percentages in each parliamentary elections. And in Lebanon, it's the father passing to the son or the husband to the wife or any of these. I mean, we've seen Taimur Jumblat, we've seen the son, Tony Fringier, the son of Sulaiman, all of these guys just inheriting seats. What choice, why would the voter even participate in such elections?
That's why the turnout in the Lebanese elections was very low, because people did not participate in the elections. And those who did, it's not because they wanted to voice their choice or like choose someone against some. In 2005, after the Syrian regime left Lebanon, after the Sadr revolution, there was a choice, limited choice between two big coalitions, the March 14 coalition and March 8, which is Hezbollah coalition. So the people did have a choice. It's not a very wide choice. You only have two people, but it's like everywhere else, like Democrats, Republicans here. It's the same thing. And then today, March 14 today is non-existent. What's left of it is very fragmented and very weak. But Hezbollah is very good at two things: being very patient, taking their time, and turning their enemies around. What they did with Aoun in 2005, but also what they did with Hariri recently, and that's another thing. So I think people today do have a choice. It's not like they don't have a choice. The electoral law did not help, but the choice, the alternative that is presenting itself in Lebanon today, there are two alternatives presenting themselves today against what we call al-Ahd. Al-Ahd is not just Hezbollah or Aoun or their coalition. Al-Ahd is really everyone in power. This is what we call Ahad. Hariri is in Ahad. Basir is in Ahad. Everybody. Establishment. Eh? So this is the alternative to this establishment. You have two. One is the civil society in Lebanon that for the first time decided to go and participate in the elections.
Seat in the elections.
Just one.
Yeah. Yes and no. Yes and no.
Jumana's seat.
Jumana is civil society. Paula was... Well, recently she became, let's say, civil society, and there are a lot of questions about that. But the problem is the civil society went into this fight with white gloves. They did not understand that the political battle in Lebanon is much more serious than just, requires a lot more than slogans that relate to democracy and women's rights, and which are great and beautiful, beautiful values. But we really have to start. The civil society needs to start to take off these white gloves and start naming things as they are and talking about the problems, the arms that are non-state arms, the non-state militias, the things that they are afraid to talk about. That's why they lost, because people did not buy this. People did not really realize that the civil society, if they come to power, what are they going to provide? They can't. They're weak. The other alternative, which is the more political anti-Hezbollah Shia, let's say, that are extremely brave. For the first time, there were a number of independent Shia who ran, obviously, clearly against Hezbollah in many districts, mostly in the Beqa, Hermel, Baalbek area, and also in the south. We've never seen, actually, lists of Shia running against Hezbollah in Lebanon before this time, and this, I think, was healthy. But this alternative, which sounded great to many people, and knowing also that the Shia community today is very fragmented and very divided about Hezbollah, so Hezbollah did not win because they're popular. But the problem is that this alternative, the anti-Hezbollah Shia, did not really provide a serious alternative. They provided a political platform that was built around one idea, which is we do not like Hezbollah. That's it. But my understanding of this is that any alternative that is going to present itself as an anti-Hezbollah alternative, the real political coalition or political message, has today, they have to provide an economic alternative. And if they cannot provide an economic alternative, they will not be taken seriously. And this is what happened today. They provided an alternative to Hezbollah that had no core. And of course, they cannot provide an economic alternative when no one is, they were not backed by in the international community. And this is another issue, is that Lebanon today, when it comes to the international community, it's not important. The support that Lebanon got in 2005 from the international community after the Syria revolution was very important, and March 14th thrived because of that. But today, these guys are on their own, so of course they cannot provide any substantial alternative. So the choices are there, but they do not. People will think, if I vote for the civil society or for the anti-Hezbollah Shia, what's going to happen next, the day after the elections? What are they going to provide? Nothing, unfortunately.
I mean, of course, many of these Shia candidates, there were even physical attacks against some of them in
That's
the
why
south.
I'm saying they're extremely brave, because they were attacked physically, they were arrested by Hezbollah's security institutions, state institutions that work for Hezbollah, and they suffered a lot, and they went all the way, they tried, which is amazing. But what I'm trying to say here is that they are there. If the international community is serious about really containing Hezbollah in Lebanon, there are a lot of alternatives. Yeah.
So in the Turkish case, we see around 85% turnout.
Yeah.
It means we're polarized, but it also means that there is something at stake. So if people are rushing to the polls, they should have at least some idea that they can change things. But I think the idea of what can be changed is changing. Back in the 80s and 90s, people were thinking about changing governments, changing policies. I think a cognitive kind of breaking point came in June 2015 when the opposition parties, in total, got the upper hand in parliament. They had a majority, but then they realized something new in Turkey. That is, they lived through the summer of hell. Bombs went off everywhere. The fighting between the PKK and the Turkish military peaked. There were, ISIS attacks, al-Qaeda attacks, fringe left attacks. Many believe some orchestrated by elements within the state, the Turkish state, and the AKP leader, former Prime Minister Davutoğlu, who for a while entertained the idea of, setting a coalition government with the opposition. He lost his seat overnight. He was destroyed at the push of a button by Erdogan. I think the lesson all Turks learned that summer is you can no longer change governments. You can no longer change policy. Elections are there. They still matter, but as a check and balance, meaning you can use elections to slow Erdogan down, but you can't use elections to change governments and bring Erdogan down. So I guess, yesterday Erdogan just swore in, and he started his new executive presidential position with I would say with a storm of decrees. So now he can issue decrees. He doesn't even need signatures from his ministers. It's like he can issue arbitrary personal decrees. And he abolished the National Security Council, the Secretariat. He restructured the entire Turkish state overnight, which means the electorate was right, meaning they have no power to change Turkey, but they had some power to slow Erdogan down. So as of yesterday, Turkey is experiencing a new Turkey, an Erdogan with zero checks and balances, who can legislate, rule, issue decrees, restructure the entire governmental system, abolish ministries, invent ministries, appoint central bank directors. So now we have an all-powerful boss. The question is, will we still see 85% turnout? Meaning, is this a turning point in Turkish political history? Will people say, you know what, we don't even have the power to slow him down anymore? Or will they say, and we will have a test case next March with local elections, which are always different than national elections, of course, because at the local level you feel that, at least I can pick my mayor, my city councillor. So hopefully some of this defeatism and lethargy will be kind of lifted, and people will again participate, go to the polls. But my sentiment, the butterflies in my stomach tells me that this might be the end of an era where we believe in the efficacy of changing things through elections.
Okay, so let me just say one thing about the whole Iraq and Lebanon election experience. My approach is comparative, and it's very instructive on how Iran handles both countries. Now we know that in Lebanon, Iran has almost succeeded in replicating the Iranian system. The Iranian system is that you have a government, elected government, you have a president and a regular army. At the same time, you have a parallel state, which is headed by the supreme leader, and he has his own army, which is the Republican Guard. This is being replicated to an extent in Lebanon. You have the state and a president and whatnot, and then you also have Hezbollah and Nasrallah. And just like Khamenei in Iran has no official, I mean, he has an official title, but he has no government function. He calls the shots. Same thing in Lebanon. Nasrallah has no official role, but he decides what happens. Now, what we know is that, and this has been debated ever since the Iraq war in 2003, how will Iran control Iraq? And to my mind, the Iranians have been trying to control Iraq. But now, if we compare Iraq to Lebanon, we can see the differences. Iran has been trying to replicate the Lebanon model and experience in Iraq. I think so far they have not succeeded. And why not? Well, I'll give you some hints. First of all, in Lebanon, in both Lebanon and Iraq, conducting a census for the population is a taboo. So no one wants to count. But we know the numbers through electoral lists. So every time these people go to elect, we have all the names of the adults who are electing. And that's how we can count how many Christians we have, how many Sunnis, how many Shia. So the Shia adults in Lebanon in this election were about 1.2 million. And these 1.2 million Shia, according to the Treasury Department, they receive $700 million from Tehran every year. So that includes a militia and funds for education and medical care and whatnot. Now, if we project this against Iraq, the Iraqi electoral lists show that they have 12 million Shia. That's 10 times as much. If Iran is to offer a similar amount of money, they will require 7 billion. Now keep in mind, the annual expenditures of the Iranian government is 68 billion. 7 billion is more than 10% of the expenditures that really blow a hole in the Iranian budget. So Iran does not have the same financial ability to buy off or to force some sort of control over the Iraqis the same way they could do in Lebanon. Now, this is the financial thing. At the same time, Iraq, like Iran, Iraq is a petro economy. So their budget is bigger than Iran. So whoever is the incumbent prime minister has resources more than the Iranians can offer to whatever militias they have. And the Iranians have done to great lengths to make sure that they install the Minister of the Interior, because this guy has money and this guy can fund the Shia militias, the Hashd al-Shabi that they have. So when the whole thing started in 2003, everyone was under the impression that we will get 3 monolithic blocks, the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurds. And in fact, Sistani was under this impression. Everyone was under this impression. And it happened during the first elections. One big Shia ticket won half of the parliament. The parliament is now 329 seats. They won 150 something, so close to the half. The Kurds had one ticket. They won almost 50 seats. And then the Sunnis probably had 30 to 40 seats. What we see now is something different, because these blocks have splintered. So in these elections, there was no one Shia ticket, there was no one Kurdish ticket, and the Sunnis were also split. So the Shia were split into 2 halves. One led by, let's call them the pro-Iraq Shia, and the other half led by the pro-Iran Shia. The Kurds were split into half. One, the independent Kurds under Barzani, and then the pro-Iran anti-independent Kurds under what used to be Talabani, but now his party. The Sunnis, ironically, have also splintered into 2. Nujayfi, who follows Turkey and Qatar, and Alawi, who follows the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So now, even if they wanted to, not even a single one of these monolithic blocks can form one big big block that can form a coalition to rule. So what we have now is that 4 big Shia blocks, and they're trying to crisscross and just try to form a coalition. So Sadr has the biggest, but it's not biggest by far. I have the numbers here. Sadr has 54. Number 2, Amiri, who's very pro-Iran, has 47. Number 3, Abadi, the incumbent Prime Minister, who is not as pro-Iran as everybody else, has 42. And Maliki, the former Prime Minister, has 26, and he's pro-Iran. So the 2 blocs that are pro-Iran have 10 MPs less than the 2 blocs that are pro-Iraq. Now, from here on, everything is just jockeying, and like Haneen said, there are no principles. There are no politics. You know, it's total trade and bargain. You know, I've give you a minister, you give me the army, I'll give you 2 seats, you give me 1 seat. Everything is up for sale, and this is good for the Iraqi democracy in a way. It's not good for the country because it'll take forever to form a cabinet, and the cabinet will always be paralyzed. But it's also not good news for Iran, because Iran expects the Shia to be like Lebanon, 1 block behind Nasrallah, and this is not happening.
But isn't one Shia bloc in Iraq holds the potential threat to Iran of being a competitor? I mean, isn't the fragmentation of Iraqi Shiites, in a sense, better for the Iranians? They want a Shia-controlled Iraq, but at the same time, not one that can emerge as a competitor to Qum or to Tehran.
Yeah.
Well, that's true to an extent if Iranians can manage to win a bloc in parliament that's significantly bigger than everybody else. So had Amiri won, say, 65 seats, and had Amiri been the person who's forming the cabinet with all the resources that he gets from the petro economy, so then Iran would have been in the driver's seat. But what happens is that you have a bloc, because the Iraqi government gets money, and when the Prime Minister gets money, then he has resources to create his own network that can stand up to Iran. And the most important part here is that the anti-Iranian Iraqi Shia can get blessings from Najaf in terms of religion, in terms of Shia coverage. And of course, Najaf has much more authority in terms of religion than Iran. And this has been bugging the Iranians. And if you remember that the first day Rouhani was elected president, the first visit that Jawad Zarif made was to Najaf. And he went and met with Sistani, and after the meeting, Kayhan, which is technically the mouthpiece of the Supreme Leader, said that Sistani pledged allegiance to the only leader of the Shia Ummah, who's Khamenei. And the next day, the Sistanis said, no, we did not. That's not true. So there's this tension. Because if you know anything about the Shia school of thinking in terms of religion, it was built on having many clerical leaders. And what Khomeini did was they said, no, they can't be many. They have to be only me. And now Khamenei is saying it's only me. And after 2003, all Iran has been doing is trying to subdue religiously. We're not talking about politics. They've been trying to subdue the religious leadership of Najaf. So far, they haven't been as successful as they have been in Lebanon.
I want to discuss the personalities that we have in these elections. In Lebanon, I mean, Hezbollah is always there, but Hariri was perhaps the greatest loser in these elections. Mm-hmm. But we also saw, I know, Hussein, you wrote an article about this, about the Lebanese forces. I mean, a Christian-based party that doubles the number of seats that they have in parliament. What role do they have to play there, Samir Shaja? Does he have a future? In Turkey, yes, the numbers were close enough in terms of the percentage of seculars that always vote against AKP, but it seemed that a certain benchmark was crossed by Muharrem Ince, that he managed to get a number larger than previous secular candidates that challenged Erdogan. And we also saw the emergence, or the final emergence, of Meral Ikşener as someone that's finally a player there. There's always been the talk of her emerging. Her party finally gets, because of the electoral system, a number of seats to be represented in parliament. And of course in Iraq, Muqtada is there, but there's also Ammar al-Hakim, who breaks from the Badr organization, the Supreme Council of the Revolution, forms his new Hikmah party. So how should we view these characters that we have seen emerging in these elections in these countries?
Okay, let me start with Lebanon, but before I go into Hariri, just a small comment on the Shia in Lebanon and Iraq. The Shia in Lebanon were, yes, at one point a bloc behind Hezbollah, but they do have major challenges today when it comes to their constituency. Of course, Najaf lost a lot of influence in Lebanon, with Hezbollah growing stronger, but the Najafi history is still there, and people go to it from time to time. And the Najaf factor, I think, is very important. It's a good idea to explore when it comes to also to containing Hezbollah in Lebanon, because despite the fact of their political power and military power, ideologically, the Najaf ideology and the Najaf influence hasn't died. So I think this is that. The other thing is, the Shia community as a bloc at one point, maybe in the year during the resistance years, if you want, until 2000, and even in 2006, the majority of the Shia were pro-Hezbollah, were like after Hezbollah as a resistance movement. Things have changed drastically since 2006, and the way, of course, the last census was in 1932 in Lebanon, so we don't know like exactly how many Shia we have in Lebanon, but it's not the majority, but it's not the minority. The Shia today, according to many polls and numbers and studies out there, I would say that maybe 20–25% of the Shia are against Hezbollah no matter what they do. But today, I would say that between 30 and 35% of the Shia, only that percentage are pro-Hezbollah no matter what they do. No matter what they do. And then you have people in the middle, between 45 to 50%, who go with the wind. They would be pro-Hezbollah in 2000.
Nabih Berri, for example?
No. Forget about Nabih Berri. His people are not, it's just like, he's important because he's still the Speaker of the Parliament. Yeah. That's it. So let me explain a little bit how I see this. Hezbollah's budget has shifted drastically during the war in Syria. After the Qusayr battle, it was the first budget shift. After Aleppo, it was the second budget shift. And the budget before Syria was 50% military, 50% the social services that Hussein mentioned earlier, because they are extremely important in maintaining the support base. Social services that would, basically they were telling the Shia when they established these social services that we're not only there to protect you and liberate you, we're providing for you. We are your protector, liberator, and provider. So the three pillars that Hezbollah built its popular base on are the resistance, the Shia identity, and the social services. So today the resistance is on hold. The Shia identity is augmented, and the services are on hold because today the social services used to cater for all the Shia community, right? After Qusayr, when they realized it's a long battle, they started to cater only for Hezbollah's community, which is not the Shia community. And then after Aleppo, or while Aleppo was happening, they shrank it to cater today only for the fighters' community. So if you're a fighter, you not only get a salary, but also you benefit from the services that no one else is benefiting from. So it's your only way of getting services. This means that the 50% in the middle who go with the wind today are not looking at Hezbollah as a resistance anymore, not as a protector, not as a provider, and these guys are more, the lower middle class, upper middle class people. The poor people mostly are fighting in Syria. So these are more, becoming more than 30%. So the Shia community today is much more diverse. The problem, which is unlike Iraq, the way Hussein described it, is that the alternative is extremely weak and Najaf's influence is very weak. But it still looks like the Shia are after Hezbollah, but it's not really black and white. It's the nuances are there. And this is why I always talk about the economic project, economic alternative, because this is where you compete with Hezbollah when they're weak in social services and economy. Back to personalities. Hariri. So Hezbollah won actually these elections, but they actually won 13 MPs out of 128, which is not a victory. They won via their allies. Their allies, their traditional allies today, have been always Nabih Berri, Amal Movement, and the FPM, President Bashar Aoun, and the foreign ministers, his son-in-law, he's today actually running the show. So I would say Gibran Bassil and Nabih Berri. These are his traditional allies. Okay, so with these guys and the pro-Assad figures that came back and other people, they won the 75 seats out of 128. But Hariri is a very interesting story because Hariri did come back as a prime minister, but he came back as a very weak prime minister who cannot form a government. And this happened because Hariri started to realize that Hezbollah won and the Saudis are not interested in Lebanon for a while. And he started to compromise. His main mission was stability. His main mission was no confrontation, but more keeping everything in order, right? So the Saudis decided that these compromises are not working. So they asked him to go to Saudi Arabia, where he resigned, or forced to resign. And he came back to Lebanon when the French intervened, and he recanted his resignation and came back as prime minister. And then after elections, they nominated him. This happened. What really happened with Hariri during that trip is that he realized when he came back that both his financial and political assets are no longer in Saudi Arabia. They are in Lebanon. And to be able to come back as a prime minister and to make money, because Saudis are not paying anymore, he needs to make more compromises, and he needs to give Hezbollah guarantees that if they bring him back as a prime minister, he will deliver. And he wouldn't come back as a prime minister, actually, unless he gave these guarantees. So they all nominated him, and he came back as a prime minister. And today, Hariri lost 1/3 of his bloc with a new parliament where he has no actual allies. With his relationship with Samir Jaja, the leader of the Lebanese forces, is very shaky. So I wouldn't say he was the head of March 14 coalition. His allies were everywhere. Today he has no allies. He had a big bloc. Today he lost 1/3 of it. Meanwhile, sorry.
And this doesn't send a message to him? I mean, he was humiliated in Tripoli.
Yes.
And then the big humiliation in the Beirut elections, where the Sunni
Beirutis punished
vote
him.
is basically...
They
doesn't this
punished him.
teach him a lesson that he needs to
Yes.
become more a champion of the Sunnis as he was in the past and compromise less?
I think you'd think so, but it seems that he heard the message, but he's incapable of changing at this point, because if he actually decided to be the champion of the Sunnis or the anti-Hezbollah people in Lebanon, not just the Sunnis, right? He won't be a prime minister. They will make a very, like in 2009, when actually he was elected as prime minister, appointed as a prime minister, and he came in 2010 to Washington during his meeting with Obama. He came into the meeting with Obama as a prime minister. He left the meeting as a former prime minister. While he was in the meeting, they overthrew his government. It's very easy. It's very easy. He simply has either to compromise and stay as a prime minister, or leave, or be forced to leave. His choice, obviously, is to compromise and stay as prime minister, which is a big loss to him. But he seems to be okay with this loss. And also the Sunni community sent a very clear message. And the problem is today, the Shia leadership are one bloc, the Christians are divided. The Sunnis were also like an alternative, if you want, community that is very united and strong. Today, and this is how Hezbollah has been working on for a very, very long time. And when the Saudis decided to stop investing in Lebanon, for many reasons, lots of them are right, they offered an alternative to the Sunnis, right? So there's something like parallel to the resistance, the Shia resistance, called the Resistance Brigade, Saraya al-Muqawami. This is the Sunni part of the Hezbollah's militias. So they've been recruiting a lot of Sunnis in the Resistance Brigade, especially in poor areas in Tripoli, in the Bekaa, and mainly in areas that are important for their geographic continuity. So if you look at Lebanese map and where Hezbollah is interested in terms of linking their areas together, this is where the Sunni areas and some other Christians as well where Hezbollah is investing. They pay minimal salaries, minimal training. They don't ask these Sunnis to go and fight in Syria because obviously they can't, the sectarian factor. But all they ask for them is loyalty. They ask from them is loyalty. And loyalty is what they get. And today, the Sunnis that Hariri lost, Hezbollah gained because of this long-term strategy that actually worked now that the space... What Hezbollah does, what Iran really does in the region, is they have a strategy and they basically see where there's a gap, a space, and they fill it. So when the Saudis left Lebanon, they filled the Sunni gap. It's the same everywhere. In Syria, you know, like the U.S. is leaving Syria, they're looking at the gaps and they're going after it. They don't want confrontation at this stage. They only want to fill the gap that everyone is leaving. So this is what happened with Hariri. And today, I think, you know, he's incapable of forming a government until, like, he makes sure that everyone is happy, and no one is happy. So that's the main issue.
So in the Turkish case, when it comes to personalities and leadership, we learn two lessons. The first lesson, leadership is necessary. The second lesson, but not sufficient. What do I mean by it? It's necessary because with Muharrem İnce, you know, a kind of a more dynamic, pro-secular leader who is, let's say, in touch with people's values and traditions. Yes, Turkey's center-left in quite a long time, you know, since the 70s has reached 30+%. That shows leadership makes a difference. Akşener, you know, as she was trying to moderate a right-wing nationalist party into a kind of a moderate nationalist center-right party with zero airtime, a lot of pressure by Erdogan, she put together a party of, let's say, roughly 10%, which shows, you know, a resilient, kind of brave woman can, even under Erdogan's kind of iron fist, can bring something into existence. The same goes for the pro-Kurdish leader, Selahattin Demirtas, who still survives from his prison cell, politically survives from his prison cell. But at the same time, we realize that all this Turkish obsession with leadership and also opposition unity were two red herrings. In what sense? Because the opposition strategy all along was, why do we lose? We don't have these dynamic leaders like Erdogan. Why do we lose? We are divided. Only if we can come together and have a strong leader or have a set of strong leaders, we can defeat Erdogan. So in that regard, I think this has been a very important election, if the opposition can draw the right lessons. The first lesson is, this was the most miraculous coalition building on the part of the opposition. Pretty much everyone was included, including a religious anti-Erdogan party, a center-left secular party, a moderately nationalist center-right party, a traditional center-right party, who got along with the pro-Kurdish party. This is the entire Turkish political spectrum who happened to be anti-Erdogan. So not a single vote was wasted, and still, you know, they got, let's say, roughly 47% in total. Second, they all had competent leaders, so this is pretty much the best leadership that the opposition can present, and still lost. Why is this an important lesson? Because it means, yes, unity is important, coalition building is important, yes, leaders matter, but if the playing field is unlevel, is so skewed, then you need something more than competent leaders and strong coalitions. So far, I'm not seeing this. The opposition is still in shock, still in trauma, haven't recovered, haven't drawn out the lessons. But they should realize we don't have media. Like, we have zero media access. We don't have a daily, except for one which sells, let's say, less than 100,000 copies in a country of 80 million. We don't have the economic base anymore. Erdogan controls the entire cake. He and, as of yesterday, his son-in-law, who is now the new economy and finance minister and everything else. So it's a family enterprise now. They realize they're completely shut out of the state. So I call it Turkey's transition from a party state to almost like a state party. Even Erdogan's Justice and Development Party doesn't matter anymore. Erdogan is the state. The state is Erdogan. Political parties, including Erdogan's party, they're all minor, kind of players, or they don't really matter. So what should be the opposition strategy beyond personalities, beyond leadership skills, beyond electoral coalitions? How can you, maybe learning from Iraq and Lebanon, I know it's paradoxical, right? We often used to talk in opposite terms, but what can Turkey's opposition factions learn from Iraq and Lebanon in terms of how can they sustain their communities in terms of self-help organizations, mobilization, because they are shut out. They know they do not have any inroads. They do not have any legitimate avenues to power, economic spoils, rights, which means this is the time that they have to, I don't know whether this would be the right term, but it's like a weaning process whereby they realize, okay, we no longer have a state. Just like in these semi-failed or failed states, we need to rely on our community organizations, our own grassroots support for social services, for media, charitable institutions, even, I know it sounds very dire, but security, meaning can they, as of today, there is now a new auxiliary Turkish police force, all in black. We were just joking about it. It looks very much like Hezbollah.
Hezbollah's police is all in
police authorities. So if you are not part of Erdogan's 50%, do you feel safe? Can you trust the new military, the new police, these new militia-like institutions? Or is this the time to start thinking, how do I take care of my neighborhood, my family, my city? Because there are still large concentrations of, let's say, pro-West, pro-secular populations in the West, and large concentrations of anti-Erdogan Kurdish populations in the Southeast. So I think it is time. I know it's extremely paradoxical, Turkey, still an accession, kind of like a member, like a candidate country to the European Union, talking about denominationalism, factionalism, kind of communitarianism. It looks like a step back, but I think this is the ugly truth. The opposition so far has chosen not to face, because you can imagine it leaves a horrible aftertaste. Meaning, what I'm talking about is like Lebanization of Turkey.
I'm sorry.
For the average Turk, of course, this is like, what? It's like nightmare. Lebanon should be like Turkey, right? On the path to Western democracy. But now, I think Turkey is at a turning point where the opposition will ultimately realize leadership and coalition building will not be the answer unless they can, let me put it this way, toughen up. They have to become harder targets to hit and exploit and push around.
Okay, so let me just say that, again, back to the comparison between the West and the Middle East. In the West, when people go to election, they elect platforms. In the East, they elect people, not the platforms. Over here, you elect ideas. Trump can be Trump, but if he was not pro-life, if he didn't talk about the wall, all the things that the Republicans would want to see in a president, over there in the Middle East, it doesn't matter. The Lebanese president, Michel Aoun, in 2003 was in this town. He called Hezbollah the terrorist organization that's at the command of this Syrian regime. Now, the same Michel Aoun is the biggest and staunchest ally of Hezbollah. So over there, ideas don't really count. What count are people, the individuals, and the way people pick their candidates or their leaders is just like how people pick their spouse. So you think of someone from many aspects, and you think you'd want to pick a leader who can provide for you, and provide in terms of security, physical security, economic security. Say the police pulls you to the side and they take you to prison, then this is the leader who will call the police and get you out of prison. Say your wife needs to go to hospital, you can't pay the bill, this leader will pay the bill for you. So these protege networks, these are the parties that we have over there. And this is why you have the same person. And then after him, Taimur, and after Taimur, Fuad was Taimur's son, and so on and so forth. Of course. So to go back to the Lebanese forces, the Lebanese forces doubled the number of seats that they had in the Lebanese parliament from 7 to 13 or 14. And the reason why the Lebanese party was able to do this was that because they deliver. So the Christians who bet on them tend to win. And the opposite applies to the Prime Minister Hariri, who's the leader of the Sunnis. He never delivers. You bet on him and you lose. Wali Jumblat, for instance, you bet on him and he delivers, even if he's not in a position to do so, but you'll still be fine. And this becomes a mutual symbiosis that you would give anything to the leader, including, you said, your sons to fight and die in Syria, and the leaders will give you back, whatever you need. This is how it is, and that's how the blocks are more or less static and fixed, which is good to an extent, but this comes at the expense of all kinds of ideas, and this is how you will see on just switching sides from pro-America to pro-Iran, and this is how you will see Maliki and Barzani, the Shia and the Kurdish leaders of Iraq, they almost went to war. They sent their troops to fight. And yesterday they were negotiating getting into a coalition together. And no one knows how these things work, but like we said, just totally utilitarian, just give and take, give me 2 ministers, take the other MP, and we'll call it a day. So it's all about personality, but at the same time, it's all about the resources and the network that this personality can. Which brings me to the point, I'm sure would want to talk about this later, which brings me to the point, how should the U.S. pick its allies over there?
I mean, I'm supposed to open by now the floor for questions, but let me briefly, 2 points here. The first is this static nature of it. Yes, there's room in Lebanon. There's a Shia wing that's more anti-Hezbollah or more open to ideas. But there's also a threatened Shia identity because of the war in Syria or because of the Sunni presence, because of anything, that Hezbollah will continue to play on the idea of the meek of the earth that have always been the victims of a Sunni Maronite dominance. In Iraq, the threat from the Daesh, the Islamic State, the idea of a threatened, again, Shia identity that continues to play there, the two camps fighting in Turkey, this tribal nature, the leader and the tribe and the positions that are fixed, how do you ever break that? But also the question of the United States. There are no pure black and white in the region. There are varieties of grays. We know Erdogan's vices, but the opposition is also, in the past especially, very strongly with leftist ideas. Anti-Americanism was always ripe among the Turkish left. None of these guys are heroes. What should the U.S. do in such a situation?
Okay, so consistency is key, right? In Lebanon, at least. There are a lot of Lebanese who would go again and form a coalition against Hezbollah. March 14 is dead, but there are other forms that can be, other coalitions that can be formed. People are not happy with the situation, but the problem is the U.S. has not been consistent in its position to Lebanon. And in 2005, it was great. In 2008, during the May 7 events when Hezbollah stormed the streets of Beirut and the mountains, nobody was there. So consistency, I think, is key. The lack of consistency produced a trust issue when it comes to the Lebanese, but also in the region as a whole when it comes to the United States. There is a big trust issue. So today there's a red line, tomorrow the red line is going to be gone. Like Syria is a very big example of that. Syria is the example of how the U.S. should work when it comes to consistency. On a smaller level in Lebanon, I think there is something, like there is always like a short-term plan and a long-term strategy. There's no strategy today. Obviously, I can't see there are a lot of tools that are being implemented, especially when it comes to sanctions. So let's take advantage of that. To be realistic, today sanctions is the word. It's a war of sanctions. So instead of waiting for a bigger strategy to be formed, instead of waiting for the real idea to be there, let's work with what we have, right? Look at Lebanon. Hezbollah won 75 seats in the parliament via their two big allies, okay? Hezbollah's economy is a cash economy. Where everything they do, they use cash. They don't really have bank accounts. So any sanctions that comes via banks or international transactions, it's not really going to hurt Hezbollah. It will annoy them, yes. They will have to find different ways of dealing with this, yes, but it's not going to really hurt them. Cash economy has been their strategy. So, but their allies, who are the most two corrupt people in Lebanon, which means they care more about their money than anything else. And this is how Hezbollah functions, actually. They bring their allies. They work with the corrupt people because they know that they can be corrupted. So their allies are corrupt. So today, without these two big allies, actually Hezbollah has only 13 members in the parliament. So I've been contemplating this idea of, instead of sanctioning Hezbollah directly, why don't you start threatening of sanctions, at least as a first step, or maybe sanctioning some of these people in both parties. They're not designated terrorists, they're not really, like officially Hezbollah members, but I'm sure there are ways. If you start talking about, or at least sanctioning one person here and there will be a lot of people who will be ready to jump ship. So you might not influence everyone, but there will be a lot of changes after HIFPA 1 was introduced. A lot of people from these two camps of allies were very worried about their money, and there were a lot of signs of many of them who were ready to jump ship or at least do something about it. It's not easy, because as a Hezbollah ally, you will be threatened if you try to jump ship, but at least they will try to do something about it. So going after Hezbollah with sanctions is a good idea, but going after their business community, I think, is a much more effective idea. This is short-term in Lebanon. Long-term, again, economic programs. Economic programs with a strategy to go to target the Shia community, per se. Lebanese in general, but mainly with a very clear strategy, because there are a lot of economic and aid programs in Lebanon, but that are not based on a strategy on the Shia community. And I think this is what we need today. But we can't think of Lebanon without thinking of Syria, right? So let's think of what really Iran wants from Lebanon and take it from there. What Iran sees the region, the way they see it is very different from the way we see the region. We see separate countries, sovereign states, despite their weaknesses, sovereign states, like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, wherever. We deal with each of one separately. Iran does not do that. Iran sees all these four countries as one big entity with a land bridge that augments the Shia identity. And to go back to your first comment here, one of the Hezbollah fighters that I interviewed once, when I asked him about the land bridge, he didn't understand the word first. For him, it's not called the land bridge. You know what he calls it? Wilayat al-Imam Ali. This is the land bridge. Imam Ali is the godfather of the Shia. Wilaya is the Islamic term for state. So it's a Shia state. It's very ideological. And this guy actually did fight in Syria, and he's been there. So for them, the Shia identity comes first, and it is really cross-national. So there's no national identity where they're dealing with. And they have an army of around 100,000, if not more, non-Persian Shia fighters fighting in all these countries and present all of them in all these countries. And that's why you see Hezbollah's regional role today is working with all Shia militias everywhere. Every war that this army is going to fight, every war that Hezbollah has, or like, let's say tomorrow there's a war with Israel. Hezbollah is no longer going to be fighting this war alone. It's an army of hundreds of thousands of men who are functioning along this big entity. It's like an empire with an army, right? So this is how Iran sees it. So we cannot think of a strategy for Lebanon without really looking at Syria. The land bridge crosses all these capitals. And today, Iran's goal is to own the capitals along these four states, right? Lebanon is different in the sense that Lebanon, they want stability in Lebanon as much as the Europeans want stability in Lebanon, as much as the United States wants stability in Lebanon. And they can easily sell stability to the international community because they need it. Why? Because Lebanon has to be their operation room. Iran sees Lebanon as an operation room, as a hub where everybody meets to plan the regional wars. Doesn't mean that Hezbollah is not going to be fighting from Lebanon, but this will be their last resort, but strongest weapon. So this is how they see Lebanon. All the offices of the Shia militias in the region operate in Lebanon. You see Iraqis, Yemenis, everyone is in Lebanon. All their medias operate from Lebanon. It's really like a stable operation room. So this is how we say it. And this is where anything the United States can do on the short-term sanctions, on the long-term. I'm not saying Lebanon stability is not important, but there is a way of looking at it without maybe keeping the Lebanon stability, but seeing Lebanon stability not as a way of helping Iran's using this stability to operate from Lebanon. Meaning that Iran in Syria, again, to isolate Iran in Lebanon or in Iraq or Syria is really the key point today. Syria is the most important part of the region for Iran today because it's still tricky. And Syria is actually where the United States can still do something. And this is where I think is most important. And I think not just in terms of a deal with the Russians, definitely what's happening in South Syria today is very important. This panel is not about Syria, so I'm just saying that Syria is where the United States can still do something, and I'm not sure if it will.
So U.S. and most of its NATO allies do not take sides. Too bad, because NATO's adversaries do take sides. So Iran engages with factions in Turkey. Russia engages. Qatar engages. Hamas engages. But most of the EU and US officials will say, you know, we treat everyone the same. You know, we respect the Turkish electorate. Too bad NATO's adversaries do not respect the Turkish electorate's will, and they always tweak. So the first suggestion is engage, meaning, of course, principal engagement. But engagement, that's, again, building on your idea of coherence, consistency, clear incentives and disincentives. Especially in the Middle East, the larger the sticks and the larger the carrots, a better response you will get. Unambiguity is very important. Appeasement is a horrible idea. Appeasement will bring out the worst in Erdogan. It will bring out the worst in authoritarian leaders. They will remember that they're bullies. They will remember that bullying works. They will bully further, both their own people, their allies, their adversaries, all across the board. You know, it's a 24/7 bullying life. Now, the problem is this, given the state of transatlantic affairs on both sides, it's not a great time to make the following recommendation, but I have always argued a transatlantic engagement is needed, because only as the transatlantic world, the West could have some leverage. And even that is questionable, but certainly going it alone, Germany, US, yes, could deliver to some extent, could offer some incentives and disincentives to Turkey, to Erdogan, but it would, of course, be much more effective. We have seen it worked before. Just to give you two ideas. 46 elections in Turkey, open voting, closed counting. Not free, not fair. 1950 elections, secret voting, open counting, and transfer of power. Why? Cold War, NATO in the making, Turkish leadership was getting the right incentives, disincentives, right signals, and it brought out the best in Turkish leadership. Turkey's EU accession, similar. Turkey lifted the far-right leader, who's the ally of Erdogan today, asking for capital punishment to be reintroduced in Turkey, was the leader who voted for the lifting of capital punishment. This is to show you that people are plastic. If you give a far-right, quasi-fascist leader the right incentives and disincentives, he will be one of the architects of Turkey's European Union accession, convergence with the Copenhagen criteria, and the European Convention on Human Rights, and the lifting of capital punishment in Turkey. And that's how it worked. And it can work again. But the problem is, back in those days, there was very close coordination between Washington and Brussels and European capitals in how to work with Turkey, how to encourage Turkey to be on the path of economic, political, social reform. And it worked to some extent. Today, on neither side of the Atlantic, we have transatlanticists. And, we will have the NATO Summit. And to be frank, most of my colleagues, like me, who follow it very closely, we're holding our breath. We buckled up. And I think we only have one idea. Can we survive this crash? Mm-hmm. So we don't have a larger vision beyond just surviving the NATO Summit. So we're not in the proactive mode. We're not even in kind of defense mode. Russia, Iran, and other adversaries of kind of the liberal Western world order, they're on an all-out assault mode. And we're not even in a fully kind of geared up defensive mode. But what's needed is, I would argue, just like we have done numerous times as the liberal world order was coming into existence, is a kind of a proactive mode in which we are not embarrassed and ashamed of our values, of our strong commitment and faith in free markets, free polities, free trade, religious freedoms, and we don't tone it down. We don't discredit peoples in the unfree world who make these demands. We don't marginalize them. We don't delegitimize them, because that's pretty much the spirit at this point. Like someone like Hanine is outlier. That's not really what Lebanon is. So she's like, come on, she's too good to be true. So that kind of logic is killing Lebanon. No.
None of yours going back, right?
Yeah. No,
I'm not planning on going back.
But anyway, so let's invest. We do have allies. We do have millions of allies who want same thing. So people in the Middle East do not just want iPhones and BMWs and I don't know what, Spotify. They also want freedom of religion. They also want freedom of expression. They also want free markets, meaning it all comes as a package. And there are millions who know it. It's important that on both sides of the Atlantic, there are others who can match those sentiments.
Okay, so in Iraq, the biggest bloc that's won the election, the Sadr bloc. Sadr is a cleric, his father was a cleric, his grandfather was a cleric, all the way to Prophet Muhammad. So this guy is really a Muslim. And his bloc of 54, 20 of these 54 are with the Iraqi Communist Party. So go figure. You have these communists who are with the cleric. So this is how fluid all these ideologies are. And to my mind, I think the best piece of foreign policy that the United States conducted in the Middle East over the past 30 years would have been the surge of troops in Iraq, which against all odds former President Bush ordered while everyone was going against it. And the reason why this succeeded is that because at a certain point, President Bush decided, okay, the government, all these ambassadors are not working, let's ask the military for their opinion. And the military came back to the president and said, look, we have to do some old-fashioned imperialism. We have to talk to the tribes, pay them money, and flip them. And that's what we did. We went to the tribes, you know, Iraqi, Syrian, Saudi, whatever they call themselves. They're tribes, they live there. Take the money, take the arms, shoot in the same directions we're shooting. It worked. So there are no countries. I mean, the whole idea that these are countries with sovereignty and you know and UN membership and all these flashy and blizzy stuff. These are things that we invented over here and sometimes try to impose over there. This is not the case. Over there, every tribe is for itself, and we can really connect with these people. Like Haneen said, one of the biggest failures, and ironically, it was also ordered by the Bush administration, was when the Hezbollahis went after tribes who are really established and known, like Jumblat. Jumblat, the Druze, he's an old-time leader, his son is a leader, his grandson will be the leader. These people can deliver, and they were counting on the US for support. And in May of 2008, Hezbollah just invaded Jumblat areas, and the Jumblat folks fought back. And they actually resulted in serious casualties among Hezbollahis. And what we did in this country was that President Cheney at the time had some influence with the UCOM. He deployed...
President Cheney?
I'm sorry, Vice President Cheney. He had some influence with UCOM, so we deployed 2 destroyers that just cruised alongside the Lebanese coast, and they didn't do anything. And I know, you know, and Haneen knows from inside sources that at the time, Hariri went to Jumblat and he said, listen, if you hold for 24 hours, the Americans are coming. And Jumblat responded, are you crazy? If we hold for 24 hours, you and I will be swimming all the way to the American destroyers. So he had to surrender. And this is the theme of this story is that there are tribes who are willing to fight. The biggest mistake of the Obama administration was to let down our guard. We abandoned the clans. We had these clans on the payroll. And the day that we withdrew out of Iraq, the very next morning, the first thing that Prime Minister Maliki at the time did was that he sent tanks to besiege the house of the Sunni Vice President Hashemi on bogus claims of terrorism. And that was the very second. And after that, Maliki just went after all these Sunni clans who were our allies. We just let them sink because at the time President Obama was trying to make nice with the Iranians. The theme of this story is that the tribes and most of the players in the Middle East know that America is not consistent. And back to consistency that Haneen talked about. If we need to support tribes like the Jumblat tribe, the Druze, or the Sunnis, we have to think about doing it for the long term, not like an administration or two. We have to be patient. Hezbollah has been with Iran since 1982. That's such a long time. So we expect to pay a tribe for a couple of years and to get magical results. It won't happen like that. And there are no states, I don't think there are states that will be coming anytime soon. And I just agree with Icahn. Of course, he's saying freedom of expression and free markets. I totally support that. But I just think that at this point, maybe we just have to do it straight. Just talk to the tribes, give them money, and say, shoot the same way we shoot.
Long game, short game. Without short game, there's no long game.
On that very positive note, let me open the floor.
But where is the U.S. shooting? The U.S. is not shooting anywhere now.
Let me open the floor for questions. There will be mics handed out, so please raise your hand, and once identified, identify yourself and ask your question.
I guess this is a question for either you or you. My understanding of the Lebanese military is that they give out certain command positions based on what sectarian group you belong to, like the commander has to be Maronite or whatever. Does that result in any sort of the military being structurally loyal to one group in particular, such that it might act against Hezbollah in the event of an internal war?
Okay. You want me to answer? Okay. Definitely the sectarian factor is not just in the military, it's everywhere. It's in the government, it's in the executive government, the presidency, everywhere. So I'm not going to go into the details, but that's basically Lebanon's constitution that was made after the French mandate, right? So this is a problem, but for many people, this is a way to preserve the diversity of all sects within the government. The problem with the military, with the Lebanese army, is not this, really. Today, when Hezbollah was created, and it was a military, parallel military organization, but Iran's plan throughout the region is based on this model, which they create a parallel military organization or a parallel state, and slowly but surely it penetrates the state institutions. And the main state institutions today that Hezbollah cares about are the security and military institutions. So this is where the influence is today. Security, like general security, and military like the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army, I wouldn't say it's all controlled by Hezbollah, but the influence is there, especially in the intelligence and some of the leadership positions. This is the problem. It's not the sectarian part. But because Hezbollah is so strong today, to the extent that we used to say that Hezbollah is a state within the Lebanese state, to describe how powerful Hezbollah is, that is actually a state within the Lebanese state, today it's more Lebanon is a state within Hezbollah state. And these state institutions are functioning within the parameters that Hezbollah has defined for them. The Lebanese army is not outside this structure. The question today, I would say, with the U.S. aid of $1.5 billion to the Lebanese army, is it good or bad knowing that the Lebanese army is influenced by Hezbollah's agenda? Yes and no. So this is, I think, the main challenge today of where the army. Would they actually get to a point because of the U.S. aid to fight Hezbollah at one point? So answer your question, no. I don't think this aid is catering this idea of turning the Lebanese army against Hezbollah. I think the U.S. aid is about helping the Lebanese army stay independent and helping the Lebanese army fight certain kinds of terrorism, mainly the Sunni terrorism, not the Shia terrorism. And everybody understands they have been doing that, knowing that they cannot actually fight Hezbollah. Hezbollah's army is way much stronger than the Lebanese army. There's no way. But is it a bad idea? I think the only two good things that can be used from this aid are, one, the Lebanese army is actually fighting Sunni terrorism and they're doing well. And two, it is a way, a leverage that the U.S. can use to push back. It hasn't been done. It has been done 3 times. The U.S. has used this aid as a leverage to push back 3 times, where during the Arsel battle, when Hezbollah started to coordinate too closely with the army, when the Russians, the Lebanese government wanted to sign a military agreement, the U.S. stopped it. And last, in my case, when I was sentenced by the military court and they were forced to recant. So these are the 3 cases that the U.S. used this aid to push back. And I think it all proved very efficient. That's why I think it has to stay, but it has to be really used as a leverage, really used to push back, much more than that. Yes.
Let me just add that in any country in the world, there's no military without a state. If the state is a failure, then the military would naturally be a failure. And there's a reason why the Iranian Revolution manufactured the Revolutionary Guard in parallel to the regular army, which is the Artesh. The reason is that these armies never fight. The only way for these people to fight is that either they're ideological or they're a tribe. So in Mosul, in June of 2014, the Iraqi army just melted overnight. And the reason it happened is because this army has nothing to defend. You know, it's corrupt. It reflects the state. The state is corrupt. And that's why we spent, this country, America, spent billions to build up an army, whereas we got the same result for a fraction of a cost when we dealt with the tribes.
So
in the past, American foreign policy has been purportedly to promote democracy around the world, especially in the Middle East. But it seems like in the Trump era that might sort of be changing, especially with that call between Trump and Erdogan and Trump's friendliness with Putin and Duterte, other totalitarian leaders. So for Dr. Erdemir, in the future, do you see the U.S. Working to protect democracy in the Middle East, especially in Turkey, or do you see more and more sympathy for these kind of authoritarian regimes?
I'm biased to answer this question. Why? Because both as formerly as an academic, then as an activist, then as a politician, I have worked very closely with both IRI and NDI and NED. Also on the European side, I work with numerous German foundations. I'm a firm believer in democracy promotion and all these outreach efforts, but with one qualification, and that is promoting democracy promoting the ballot box, or is promoting democracy promoting the conditions that will ensure free and fair elections, and the latter being institutions. So I'm a hardcore neo-institutionalist. I think that the concerted transatlantic strategy should be first and foremost about institution building, about ensuring some level of polyarchy, some level of checks and balances either are maintained or come into existence, in the Balkans, in the Middle East, in North Africa, Central Asia. It's pretty much, I'm a universalist, so I do not, cross countries or regions out. I know there is some defeatist thinking lately saying, that's mission impossible. Those people are condemned to slavery and exploitation and whatever, one-man rule and torture. No, I think, going back to the lessons we have drawn from the Second World War, going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, going back to even, the European Convention on Human Rights, which brought even higher standards, I think it can be done. The problem is when we mix the order, when we put the ballot box before institutions and rule of law, we tend to get these kind of strongman, one-man rulers, dictators, which then undermines our faith and confidence in kind of the liberal democratic world order. My suggestion is if we do it the other way around, stronger institutions could start delivering semi-free and semi-fair elections, which could renew our faith in these universal values.
Thanks very much. I have a pair of questions, if I could. The first is about the political marketplace. And on the supply side, you're describing this kind of hereditary aristocracy of warmed-over faces and figures. And in my own travels to places like Iraq, you hear this demand for fresh faces, and then they hold an election and throw out all the junior parliamentarians, but all of the list leaders are the same. Is it something about political structure or societal structure or other barriers to entry that prevent these kinds of fresh faces from coming? That was the first question for any of you. And the second one is about if elections, if we're debating whether and how they really matter, something that you see happening in other countries that have authoritarian elections, essentially like Egypt and Jordan, are opposition boycotts. And I'm wondering what you make of that as a tactic, and how you kind of think about this from an opposition perspective, confronting elections where some degree of power may be contested, but very few people would call them free and fair.
I'll take the first question. Right? Okay. Your first question goes back to the people versus ideas. And the problem is the expectation of the people who are electing these leaders. And this takes us back to the time when Sultan Abdul Hamid in Istanbul was the last sultan who was effectively the ruler. At the time there was a debate in Arab countries that we need to split from the Ottomans because they're Turks, we're Arabs. And at the time, this Sultan Abdul Hamid guy, he was doing great in terms of economics, and all the missionaries, the American University of Beirut came to Beirut. All the markets were open. They're all called Hamidiyya markets in Baghdad and Fallujah and Damascus. he was doing good in terms of economics. He was delivering, but he was bad as a tyrant. So from there came the idea, the enlightened despot. And this enlightened despot is just probably the thing that most of the electorate prefers, at least to my knowledge. Cousins I talk to, friends I talk to, they want someone who's strong, who can just put everyone in prison and make things work. And they don't realize that this strong man is exactly what we're talking about. Okay, you got a strong man, then no one can say anything. Okay, so enjoy whatever you're getting from this strong man. So the Iraqis just ask for things that they vote against. And if you look up the platform of Prime Minister al-Abadi, he endorses all of the IMF and World Bank recommendations, privatization and shrinking the government. And then by the same breath, you scroll down, and he's also saying we need subsidized housing, and So yeah, he has two conflicting platforms going in one, and that's how the electorate behave. They want someone who's clean, but at the same time they expect there's someone to give them housing and money.
All of Congress is hated except my congressman.
Yeah,
He's the guy.
Boycott is a very difficult question, which opposition parties often kind of try to grapple with. There are pros and cons. The cons being the Turkish opposition so far, despite the unfree and unfair nature of elections, have managed to slow things down. Meaning, let's do a counterfactual here. If the opposition tried to boycott elections or some of the referenda or some of the local elections, where would Turkey be now? My guess is we would have reached today's kind of one-man Erdogan rule possibly 5 to 10 years earlier. But this doesn't mean that, boycott should be ruled out. For example, if I were to take an educated guess, I think Turkey's return to a semi-free and semi-fair election can be through the blackmail of boycott. That is, if all the opposition parties, way ahead of an election, can come together and have a clear united front telling Erdogan, you know what, we will only compete in the elections if the following conditions are met. The question is, would Erdogan risk the appearance of a single party kind of Turkey, or would he give in terms of some ballot box security, some electoral law reform, some fair financings, at least some access to state media? But again, the key question is, I think only a very well planned and very well executed threat of boycott, at least in the Turkish case, could deliver. But with my caveat, there are of course huge risks involved.
I'd love to continue this for a longer time, but there's a World Cup match for us mortals who care about actual football and not American one. So we've already exceeded time, and there's a match to catch.
And a lot of what we discuss applies to Belgium as a divided state.
I mean, I'm cheering for Belgium. So on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists and the end of the discussion.